Okay, so the first theory I'm going to talk about is behaviorist, and I did connectionism under that category. So the first strategy that I'll talk about is starting with an easy text and moving on to a harder one. So for example, I just did this one with my students a few weeks ago. It's called The Dead Won't Hurt You, and it's probably like a 5th or 6th grade level text, and I was trying to teach them a reading strategy with it. So we started out with this easy text. It's only a couple of pages long. And then I moved on to a couple weeks later, the Scarlet Ibis, which is more about like a 6th or 7th grade text. It's a little bit longer and a little bit more mature themes. The first story is just kind of like a silly ghost story, and this one is more about death and disability and things like that. So a lot of them thought that was sad too. And then the last one is called Harrison Bergeron, and that's by Kurt Vonnegut. And this one is more of a high school level text. And it's longer, and it has to deal with like a dystopian society, and different people have different rights and abilities. And so we kind of moved from easy to medium to hard. And that connects with connectionism, because it has to do with the law of effects and starting out with something easy, and you get like a good result after that, and then you move on to something harder, and that kind of encourages them to continue on their behavior. So again, it's the effect after the behavior impacts the behavior, and in this case, hopefully the students continued on and were able to master all 3 levels. And then the other connectionism activity that I did with them is Say Something, and that's from our favorite book, right? When Kids Can't Read, Kylene Beers. And so what I did is I took this from her book, and I just kind of made this sheet for them. They're paired up with partners, and I tried to do it by ability. And so they basically record down as they're reading what their partner says to them. And I also give them this chart from the book too, just to help them come up with sentence starters. And so this kind of connects also to connectionism, because again, it's what happens after the behavior of reading that impacts their desire to continue. So what I found with this activity is that they generally have a lot of success with it, because they're able to understand the text that they're reading, especially with something difficult like Harrison Bergeron, because that one's really tough. So if they have their partner and they're following along and making, these comments and asking questions and things like that, it helps them understand what they're reading, so they're more likely to continue the behavior of reading. So it's the effect after their behavior that impacts what they're doing. So that is behaviorist. And then the next one I did was constructivism. And under that one, I did schema theory. So one of my favorite things to do, especially with the text Night, which I used to teach with freshmen, was the KWL chart. So like normally this would be on the board, but I just kind of put it on the notebook so it was easier to see. So what I did was I had them come up to the board and just kind of write down whatever they knew about the Holocaust or concentration camps or World War II, things like that. So this was some of the stuff that they came up with. And of course we had a lot more on there because it was on the whiteboard. And then I kind of split it up and tried to group things together that made sense. So like this one, SS officers, Hitler, and the Third Reich, we kind of categorized into the military. And then Auschwitz, concentration camps, and this list right here became the conditions of the camps. And so we used that to make these categories, and then we came up with our what do we want to know? So what else do we want to know about the military? Was the service voluntary or mandatory? How exactly did the SS forces operate? Like what kind of strategies did they use, or what kind of weapons did they have, things like that. Who were the German allies? And then going down to the next category, we had some questions like what was the food like, what were the survival rates, things like that. So eventually the kids found answers to those, mostly in our book, Night, and then that became our What We Learned column. So that connects to constructivist theory and schema theory because they're building on their background knowledge. So they're, categorizing all this information into different schemas, and then as they read, we're kind of expanding them because they were answering all the stuff that they didn't already know. So that was schema. And then the other one that I did, the other instructional strategy that goes along with that, is this analysis writing that I did with my sophomores this year. And these questions are actually on that Harrison Bergeron dystopian book or story. And so I came up with these questions that had to do with kind of like their view of society. So like people in the story have to wear these handicaps to try and make them equal. So smart people have to wear something that makes them less smart, and strong people have to wear things that make them weaker. And so all the questions are kind of geared towards like, do you think these effects are positive or negative, or are they, good for society or bad for society? And so my thought behind that in relation to schema theory was that it changes their concept of society. So they may have thought like, oh yeah, people being equal, that's a good idea. But when they actually saw how it was being carried out, it's like, no, that really wasn't all that great of an idea, because you're taking away people's intelligence and their natural abilities and things like that. So that kind of altered their existing schemas, or modified their existing schemas of society. So that was that one. And then last was I did social learning theory, which was Bandura's theory for my like free choice one. And I picked two strategies for that one. The first one was just basically just modeling. And so this was a graphic organizer I came up with to model rereading. And so we would read a text like The Dead Won't Hurt You or The Scarlet Ibis or what have you. And we would kind of fill out this chart together. So I would kind of do an example after we read through the story one time. Here's the information that we know. What questions do we have? And then they would go back and read parts of the story to answer their questions. And that would kind of be like their second read. So now that we've answered these questions, what do we know? What other questions do we have? And then if we needed to go back and read it a third time. And so basically I would go through and show them how to do that strategy first, and that was my modeling of the strategy, and then they could do it on their own. So obviously modeling would go along with observational learning, because they're seeing somebody else do it and then trying to imitate the same action, but it requires a lot of thought and application. They can't just like copy down words. They have to actually understand it and apply it to be able to read and then summarize and ask their own questions. And so after doing this one a few times, I also found that it connected with social learning in the self-efficacy aspect, because they got a lot more confident. So like we started out with The Dead Won't Hurt You and then The Scarlet Ibis, and now they're on to these really tough high school texts, and they're okay with it. Like they're actually trying to figure it out and asking lots of good questions and understanding the themes and things like that. And along those lines, I also did this independent reading project, but the part that I want to talk about is the book talks that I had them do. So after they would read a book, they had to, like it says, just do a brief little talk to the class, a couple minutes, where they had to talk about what they liked, what they didn't like, what they would, who they would recommend the book to, where they got the book so they could tell people, if they were interested, where to get it, and like a quick summary. So obviously, that one would also be observational learning, because people are viewing each other, enjoying books and liking books and reading for fun and things like that. And also, this one also went along with self-efficacy, because the kids were just more motivated to read. So they saw someone else who had a good time with it, and then they were like, oh, well, if that kid can do it, then I can do it, because he's a low reader and I have a hard time with reading. But if he had fun with this book, then, maybe I could too. So it kind of encouraged their confidence. And those are my 3 theories and my instructional strategies.